So I'm interviewing Andy Estes from Nashville, Tennessee, who teaches American Literature and History at the LMU in Munich. And I'll be asking a few questions about his talk regarding freedom and constraint, or constraint and freedom in Jonathan Franzen's novel, Freedom. Yeah. So my first question for you would just be how your talk relates to our symposium of aesthetics of restraint.
I wanted to look at a contemporary novel by Franzen that addresses the topic, or at least seems to address it. And I chose Franzen's novel because I was interested because the interpretation was like basically everybody decided that they knew what it meant, right? Like Franzen went on television and decided and told people exactly what he meant writing it, and then David Brooks and a lot of the other reviewers, they all reviewed it and they said it was, it was kind of a contemporary response to Bush's, like what they considered his misuse of the word freedom, and Franzen wanted to correct it, and his phrase was always to restore the term to its problematic glory. That's what Franzen kept saying, and everybody, and the critics, it was well reviewed, but they all kind of echoed his initial assessment of what he was doing, and it seemed like such an open and shut case that's why I wanted to write about it.
Okay. Now, would you say Franzen enacts a lot of freedom, or in his novels, or does he restrain himself anyway? Do you see that as a writer he focuses more on his liberties as a writer, or restraints as a writer?
No. Do you mean? Well, I think it's maybe interesting to think about freedom and constraint, like on the level of maybe like what happens, like on the level of plot, like what gets talked about, and there I think it's really without restraint, because it's one of these novels that like attempts to do everything. It's a family novel, but Franzen, he's really widely read and he's competent in so many different fields, and so you get environmentalism, you get U.S. politics, you get like the Iraq War and very political stuff, you get a lot of family stuff, you get psychology, so everything gets mixed in, and the narrator is really wide-ranging, and there's been some articles on freedom, and I think Dawson calls him the omnicompetent narrator, and that he speaks to every field, and his knowledge is so deep, and that becomes the sort of the narrator's view on the world, where if you were to know, like it's narrator speaking to the characters, if you were to know what I know, then you would be able to manage your affairs better. So,
I see. Okay.
So position, but I think what I find interesting about Franzen, he's been like very militant about his realism, and saying that this is the only way it makes sense for him to write, and then he keeps producing these novels of these family novels. So I would say, like, as far as his realism goes, he doesn't like experimental fiction very much, and so for me it's a very constrained thing what he's doing. I find this very interesting, that topic-wise on level of plot, that he ranges all over the place, but then when it comes to aesthetic mode, he's very much attached to realism or neo-realism, however you want to put it, and he's really not into, like I said, more experimental modes of writing. So
in a way, maybe he restrains himself to that theme, or he's using his choice to choose that theme, but not diverging from the family theme? Or?
I guess I mean like a way of writing. Like if you compare Franzen with other writers, like I really like George Saunders. He's got this wonderful book called Fox 8. Okay. It's Fox 8 because the foxes talk to each other, and one of them learns to read by looking in the window, and the whole novel is written from the fox's point of view, and it's very funny and wonderful, and it's a very different way of telling a story. Or he's got Lincoln in the Bardo, which is it's some narration. It's about President Lincoln and his son, his family, and it's got some narration by the narrator, but it's also got interspersed within it contemporary quotations from the 19th century from a whole host of characters. So it's a very odd sensation reading it, because you're not really given much as a guidepost how you should really even who was saying what, or as a guidepost for how you're supposed to interpret it. And the reader's given quite a bit of freedom when you read Saunders, Lincoln and the Bardo, about interpretation, about what's going on. So I would sort of contrast that liberty of aesthetic mode to what's going on in Franzen, which is realism, which started in the 19th century, but it's sort of never gone away, even though the postmodern, is a thing, and but Franzen he wants to orient back to these 19th century ways of telling the story, but in a 21st century context, and it's I find the tension interesting between those things.
Yeah, well, speaking, you mentioned aesthetics, and during your talk you phrased the question at the end for us if there's a relationship between aesthetic mode and free will. So after your talk and the Q&A, do you feel that you have a more clear answer to that question yourself, or how would you describe that relationship?
No. I'm not sure. One of the participants actually thought no, that everything could be expressed equally by some aesthetic mode, but I'm just wondering if you choose realism, where the narrator knows everything and he's controlled people's thoughts, and it's kind of a mirror to reality. What's happening in reality is faithfully transcribed on the page. I wonder if that might tempt you to tell certain stories as opposed to other ones. And so I mentioned Fox 8, which is written from the fox's perspective. It's a very different thing. And also Lincoln in the Bardo, it's written from the grave. Like the Bardo is the Buddhist term for a sort of like space or phase between life and death when you're passing over from one realm to another. And I'm just wondering, like if you choose, let's say, to write a fable or a sonnet or a realist novel, that determines your choice of the topic, what it is you're saying.
Sure.
And because Franzen keeps talking about the American family, I wonder that's because he writes realist novels. If he wrote different kinds of, in different aesthetic modes, maybe the subject matter would change. That's kind of a blunt way of putting it, but I'm interested in this question.
Yeah, and I've heard that Franzen has a very particular style of writing, so not just this family theme that you mentioned, a neo-realist style, but just the actual, his way of forming sentences and his prose. How would you describe that as a reader?
He has a great ear. This is where I sound more like someone who's reviewing a book than someone academia, but he has a really great ear for American speech patterns. Okay. And I hear that when he gives readings, like that he has a really incredible Patty voice where he can make her sound in a way that everybody recognizes exactly the person he's talking about. So I think he has a wonderful ear for human speech, and the novel is tremendously funny, which obviously when you do this in an academic setting, it's really hard to do this justice. But it's really very impressive. Yeah. And I saw Franzen give a reading and of freedom. You say nice, but actually it was in German, and he knows German, but the pronunciation was such that I couldn't follow. Yeah. And I missed all of his wonderfully like idiosyncratic ways of doing Patty's voice and stuff. So I've heard he's a master of this.
Is there a particular, speaking of just the hilarity or the comedy behind the novel, is there a particular scene or character that you feel is most entertaining? Or perhaps maybe a character that's most unique, or? Yeah,
I feel like they're all really entertaining. I think I like Patty the best, but perhaps that she's the main character and she gets the most lines. But the sort of depth of her like self-agonizing, self-loathing, it just becomes like incredibly funny. Not at all in like a cruel way, but she's also a character who sort of laughs at herself and makes fun of herself. So I find her really entertaining. But like I said, this is not really like an academic type response from me, but this is just my own pleasure as a reader. But I also loved his character of the Richard Katz, who's the musician with whom Patty has an affair, and I'm a musician myself, and I really like the way that how dismissive Katz is about everybody's music except musicians that you've never heard about, and this is hilarious to me too.
Yeah, I think you see that a lot today too, with some people who refuse to listen to anything mainstream, or yeah.
The type is well known, and it's great that Franzen's a wonderful writer, and that he can put his finger right on this and make it so clear that it's very, very funny.
Yeah. Well, you also mentioned the topic of free will, and I think, did you say that free will does not often come up in Franzen's novels or in the novel Freedom, or would you say his characters have access to free will or enact their free will? And then
I think it's a matter of interpretation. I need to look more. I've read a bunch of articles on Franzen, maybe like 10 or 12, just to do this, or at least peruse them. But I didn't really find much about free will in Franzen, and it kind of depends on if you're looking for it or not, whether it comes up. What I'd really like to see is a sort of quantitative study where, like, if you analyze like language use about how often the characters do something that they don't want to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it seems like that happens quite often in Franzen, and I was trying to compare it to other realist novels like Tolstoy, and it also happens quite a bit in Tolstoy, and it becomes almost like a theme, like with like the main characters like Anna and Vronsky, they continually want one thing and they see themselves doing another. And for me, I'm, like I said, like a quantitative, this will never happen, I'd like a quantitative study about like linguistic uses, about linguistic references to the problem of free will. It seems like if you say that you want something and then you act in another way, then well, you're saying something about free will in that case. And my sort of, I guess, more of an accusation about the way Franzen's narrator, not Franzen himself, the way Franzen's narrator thinks about free will and freedom is that he's kind of a libertarian, that it's a deterministic universe, it's a realist novel, but that in this one particular case, that of free will, that people, like, they're the author of their own thoughts and fully responsible for things that they do and say and feel. And that seems to be contradictory of much psychology and neurology and brain science, and it even flies into the face of things like Freud, which with his theories of the unconscious, show that we are really not master of our own thoughts. But it seems to be alive and well in popular culture, and it really comes up in Franzen's novel. And I get the feeling Tolstoy's much more comfortable with this notion of that we do things that we don't want all the time. But like I said, it's more of a hunch, and that's why I would like something statistical, with numbers. But I don't know if you can ever quantify like novels in this way, but it would be cool to try it.
Yeah, maybe you want to write another thesis, or
we need someone who can do math, which is not me.
Well, the free will that you just mentioned, you said like a libertarianism type of free will, or because you said there are 3 different approaches to free will. Is this,
right. So philosophically speaking, there are 3 approaches to the problem of free will, and one is determinism, which doesn't believe free will exists. That we that our choices, they all come from our genes, our the environment, things like this, and that we just make choices. And that we're not the conscious author of our thoughts. And then libertarianism, which is also that we live in a deterministic world for everything but our own decision-making process, that our brain is somehow not subject to the same laws as like planets or oceans or stars or whatever, which is very suspect. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's an odd position. And then there's compatibilism, which is that you believe in free will, that in a way, but you kind of believe that a person, the concept of a person as a rational decider, it's much broader than just deciding rationally, but it includes like you're somehow responsible for your genes or responsible for your environment, because when making a decision there are both like parts that you choose, you make that decision rationally, but then these other influences are you. So you, the person, are also like your unconscious mind, and like I said, your genes and background, or drugs that you've consumed. And I know I like this philosophical breakdown because I think in popular culture and even in the justice system, I guess we're really libertarians. If you look at the way laws work and the way people talk about, like in Franzen's freedom.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it makes philosophical sense or sense on the level of neurology, like the way the brain is wired, and because it seems to make a big exception for people. And I can see why a lot of people would resist this concept of us not being us, that we're not really the ones in charge.
Almost contradictory in a way.
Sure.
Now, would you say that all three of these approaches show up in the novel Freedom, or was it mostly?
Like I said, I think my accusation is that it's basically like libertarianism, or that's the perspective, that's the narration, it's the perspective of the narrator, and that I think like other writers like Cormac McCarthy are much more sophisticated when it comes to free will. There's a lot in Blood Meridian, but in all of his novels about choice and choosing, and I think with McCarthy it would take kind of a really long article, and it still would be hard to pin him down, but you sort of see the machinery of the McCarthy's prose sort of working at this question of free will, and McCarthy seems like it's one of the main topics in this text is trying to say something about what it means to want something.
Do you think there are a lot of similarities, since you also mentioned, I think, No Country for Old Men during your talk, between Cormac McCarthy's writing style or themes that often appear in his works and Jonathan Franzen?
I kind of think of them as being not having much to do with one another.
Okay.
That's kind of why I wanted to bring McCarthy in, just to have a contrastive example.
Okay.
So I think in terms of like aesthetic form and what the what the authors are really interested in, it seems like very different things. Even their public persona. I don't want to confound writer and text too much, but even their public personas are diametrically different. Like Franzen loves to talk and gives lots of interviews, and McCarthy is 80-something, has given, I think, 4 interviews.
Wow.
And like one of them might even be in print. You know? I mean, so they have very different views on many things, and also the purpose of literature. I think thematically, if you look at the criticism on McCarthy and Franzen, they also like diverge wildly. So.
Yeah, very different public personas.
That too.
Going back to one of the questions that was raised during the discussion, I guess this difference between constraint and restraint, since your topic involves constraint in the novel Freedom, do you have a definition of?
No. That's one not problem. I mean, this is a talk, so it's like where you sort of expose some ideas, and I had 20 minutes to expose these ideas, and I think I might even drop the section on free will and maybe focus on more like definitions of constraint and restraint. There's also the topic of freedom and liberty.
Yes, that's another one. Yeah, I was curious about your opinion on those, how similar or different they are.
Yes, because it's a talk. I don't know that excuse if it has playing very fast and loose with all these terms. And with freedom and liberty, I guess I have a bit more to say because I mean, they're different in their etymologies, like, the sort of the story of words, like the freedom being Germanic and liberty coming from like a French or Latinate background. And also, if you look at their use in popular American culture, freedom is used much more often, and by speakers of all like educational backgrounds. And liberty, I'd say, is used more in specific contexts and with more educated speakers. It's in the foundational documents of American political life, and this comes from an 18th century context with the founding fathers, who a lot of them were extremely conversant with French and Latin philosophy, and so it becomes a word of choice. But then in modern American usage, it's more freedom, which is a Germanic root, and Germanic words are usually a bit sort of earthier than the words that have a French origin or etymology, and those words tend to be more theoretical, more specific. So there's a definite tension there. But Franzen uses them and his character used them, I think, almost interchangeably, which is the way most Americans do, but each one has a feeling or sort of, it has a very different feeling, and in an academic paper you'd have to tease that out.
Sure.
And I think especially because I talk about John Stuart Mill, who, his book is called On Liberty, but he had the word freedom available in the 19th century, of course, and he didn't use it.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. And then Rousseau is, in French there's this liberté, and of course, and he's constrained to just this one word. So I have to tease out that distinction, try to say something intelligible then about the novel.
Oh, wow. Going back to the very beginning of your talk, and you mentioned that Bush used the word freedom in the post 9/11 speech, and the appropriation of this type of word. So I was curious about your opinion on how dangerous it is how dangerous the appropriation of these politically charged words can be, or what impact that might have on the general public when a politician like Bush enacts this or uses this word so often, such a charged word like freedom.
Yeah. That's a great question.
Kind of a broad question.
No. It's a great question. I think you could actually just answer it in trying to. If you could draw a line between propaganda and because every politician basically, when they give a speech like that, it would be propaganda, and I'm not using that in really a negative sense, and then seeing where this goes. If you read people like Chomsky, then he would definitely say that Bush's linking of freedom to attacks of 9/11, that this obscures geopolitical factors, and it's basically lying to the American people and trying to gin up hate against an enemy, and to really make things black and white, they hate our freedom, giving people a buzzword in order to be a warmonger.
Sure.
So I think I think Chomsky would obviously would be very, very critical about something like that. You might have other right-wing voices who say, well, it's simplified, but in a sense, if you look at, I don't know too much about this, but maybe there's documents that show that terrorists in 9/11 did hate freedom, and I don't know, or that they part of the reason for attacking was that they didn't like people in the West who were not Islamic and who had a different belief system. But even whether or not that's true, your question was whether it's dangerous.
Yeah, just how if you have a feeling for how dangerous this can be, or
Yeah. I think it's to take one of the most, or perhaps the most emotionally charged word in the American. In American life, and then to say that our enemies hate it, and then depending on how you define those enemies, whether they're a specific country or a radical ideology or all Muslims, depending on how you, I think it can be quite dangerous, and Bush probably knew that as well, and was willing to take that lead. So.
Thank you very much for
Thanks a
answering
lot
my
for listening
questions.
so closely to my talk.
Yeah, well,
Asked some good questions.
It was very interesting, and it was amazing how you tied in John Stuart Mill and Rousseau and Cormac McCarthy and Jonathan Franzen with freedom. So it's a lot of food for thought, and has definitely inspired me to read a bit more Franzen. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.